Yeah, so before we start, are you up? I mean, I know it's the last like talk, so let's focus a bit and like try to liven up before we go back to the party. And yeah, so first of all, my name. Let's address the big elephant in the room, right? Like usually, when I introduce myself to anyone in Europe, I get the question of like, yeah, sorry again, what's your name? And honestly, like I thought of having an introduction of explaining how to pronounce my name, but it took so long from the time of the presentation that I had to remove it. But yeah, so just pronounce my name the way you see it. So first of all, as I said, this is my full name. I originally come from Cairo in Egypt, and I lived for around 4 or 5 years in Budapest in Hungary, and then I'm currently for the last 2 years living in Berlin in Germany. I think that like the thing I would like to start this presentation, and probably I usually start almost any presentation with, is that in the 12 years, which some people can see as short time in this industry, some people can see as long time in this industry, I learned one thing, is that communities matter the most. So regardless of how good your code you write, communities is the thing you care about the most, right? And that's why I dedicate a big portion of my work into doing things like, I don't know, speaking conferences, organizing stuff, meetups, uh, Rails Girls, all these kind of initiatives is very important for you as an engineer before being for you as a human being. So, why am I here? Who here knows about the term hype-driven development? Oh, come on. This is originally a Polish TOS name, actually. This is a blog post from a guy named Marek. I hope I didn't pronounce it wrong. He's Polish, and he speaks about this tendency in our industry to follow hypes. For example, Pavel was speaking about this, right? In event store, now you will go home, and then you start to write a blog post, and I don't know, following this hype, right? Following this trend. Our software teams in general tend to make technical decisions based on a hype, right? Based on what other people call a hot technology, rather than really relying on solid research. In fact, many people ignore their project needs, what they are actually trying to build, because they want to build like based on this hype, right? I would like to use Event Store to build a blog, as he mentioned. Like, why, really? Um, the or the weird thing is that what I noticed is that people who are called seniors, or like people who earn money as seniors, tend to even promote hypes more than juniors in some situations, right? Like it's a bit weird because you assume that with experience you would start to debunk these things more, but I have seen people, the more getting experience they are, the more being strongly opinioned about say things and just wanting to follow it so much. I don't know why. And on the other side, like beginners are super confused by the term hypes, right? Like when you go to a beginner and you just give this opinion and like they're like, but why? And honestly, no one knows how to answer why, because you didn't get it out of research, you just got it out of a conference or a blog post. And yeah, it's no hidden that there is this sort of like what I usually like to call Ruby trashing hype. I will not mention like faces or anything, but for example, today in the queue, I was like getting like the barbecue, and there was like some trails of Ruby trashing hype. Like Ruby is not good for modern web. Ruby is not good for that. Ruby is not good for this. In general, if you just go on Google and type the word Ruby is dead, you will find, I don't know, 12 million conference talks. Ruby is dead and Ruby is done and all this kind of stuff. And don't get me wrong. When I say about something it's a hype, I don't necessarily mean it's wrong, right? Right things can get hyped as well. Perhaps to understand this further, maybe we should dig into what I like to call the anatomy of a hype. What's actually a hype? A hype starts usually from a reality. So there is no way a hype comes from nowhere. There is usually something real. There is someone that had a real problem that solved it with a real solution, or spoke about something that's super real in some conference and it fits their problem so well. But then you get into this state of buzz. Yeah, like people heard about MongoDB is the solution of everything, or microservices is the solution of everything, or serverless is the solution of everything, or event sourcing. Like there is this buzz that gets created by some terminology without people even understanding it so well. And then we get to the state of mania. And the state of mania is like every single conference has to have this topic. And every single person who has a blog post has to write how to write a to-do list using that technology. And like somehow everyone on earth becomes like this manic about this new technology or also talking about this problem. But of course, and I think most of us have seen that, you have to reach the state eventually of disappointment, right? Serverless is great, but it's not the solution for everything. Uh, Microservices are great, but not when you are two team people, right? When you are like two people team, doesn't make sense. Stick with your monolith. And here's the most important part of a hype, in my opinion. There has to be a moment where the community has to get back and realize, understanding, okay, this is the origin of it. It applies in this context, and that's it. That's the scope where it works, and it doesn't work anywhere else. My idea with what I'm going to talk about today is trying to realize this Ruby trash hype, right? Like, it's not all pink, it's not all blue. There has to be a way that we understand, like, what is behind this Ruby hype. One last important note is that I will complain a lot about Ruby in this talk, but this is in no way me dissing the Ruby core team, right? Like, of course, as I said, like, I have 12 years in this industry. Some of these people are programming from the day I was born, maybe even earlier. So, like, it's not dissing, it's not saying that they did a bad job, it's just simply criticizing or showing my way, basically, of trying to help them. So what am I actually trying to do? This is a project called What is Wrong with Ruby. I started this project in February or January last year, I think, in Ruby on Ice. And it's a research project. It's not coding, it's more like a research project with basically 3 goals. The first goal is what I already explained, right? We need to have more solid claims behind this hype of Ruby trashing. Why are people complaining about Ruby? I need to understand solidly, not just by saying things like, it is not fast enough. No, be solid. What do you mean? I would like, and I already spoke to some people in the core team, that by the end of this research, we can actually have data that we can provide to the core team that says, okay, this is what we think is the problem with Ruby. Let's think more strategically of how will we move on with this Ruby project. But for me, and this is at least the closest part of this project to my heart, is that we also need to stop ignoring beginners, and we need to start to, when we say Ruby is bad, at least explain to them why Ruby is bad or why Ruby is good. Try to address beginners when we speak about these problems. And yeah, being one of those people who earns my money as a senior software engineer, I have a lot of thoughts on Ruby, right? I worked with Ruby a lot, and I faced a lot of bottlenecks in the past, and it makes me uncomfortable, right? I complain about Ruby a lot of times in my workplace. But is it really enough? Is my own experience and context enough to say that this is a problem with Ruby? I mean, who am I really to judge? I worked in this specific set, in this specific project. Maybe it's part of my side. And here, when it came the idea that I need to involve as much people as possible from the Ruby community, right? It's not just me who will say this, but the Ruby community is the one that's responsible of tackling these problems. The research plan is basically 2 rounds, and the first round goes through this qualitative interviews. That's what I call this round. It's mostly talking to people as long as possible about a lot of things, you know, like with a clear question set, but at least I open the conversation as much as possible. Yeah, to run quickly through the focus groups or the people I'm actually trying to interview, like people who are core contributors of different Ruby implementations. So CRuby, Truffle, JRuby, MRuby, Topaz. So far, I already spoke to people from JRuby, Truffle Ruby, some committers to CRuby and Topaz Ruby, and I already have scheduled people from the core team. Yeah, I need to speak to maintainers of gems, right? Like those are probably I would say the second most influential people into the community after the people who maintain the language itself. So I spoke to, I don't know, maintainers of VCR, SimpleCov, Shoes. There are some other gems. There is RSpec and Rubucop in the way, so these are all already scheduled. I need to speak to Ruby communities and event organizers. As I said, like for me, Ruby is not just the language. There is a lot of community around it, so I need to know more from the organizers. And I already spoke to people who organize several Ruby meetups, several Ruby conferences. Sadly, until now, it's only across Europe. I need to speak to engineers who left Ruby for things, right? Like people who stopped doing Ruby, people who gave up on Ruby and moved to Elixir, because they probably are the ones that know the most these problems. So I spoke to people who moved to Elixir, Clojure, Rust, Erlang, Java, and at the end, Ruby engineers. And here comes the first group that I somehow still fail to reach. I would like to hear more from beginners, right? Beginners are still scared to even do that interview. No, like please come and approach and let's talk. The other group that I'm also failing to reach is the academics, right? I haven't had so much luck in meeting Ruby academics, like academics that focus on Ruby. So if Sotaro can connect me to the group working on the type check, I would really appreciate it. So that's the setup, right? The next point is this focal points. I would like to speak about like the things I focus on in interviews, so highlight some quotes from these interviews that I have done so far. Maybe it's important to mention like in the last 2-3 months, I haven't been doing interviews because I had a lot of stuff happening in my life, but I would like to continue soon. And the first topic is performance, right? Because probably like that's the biggest thing that people usually criticize in Ruby. Ruby is slow, or Ruby is not performant. But I find this sentence super vague because performance is actually a very broad term on its own. Performance is not about speed. This is a misconception. When I say that something is performant, doesn't necessarily mean it's fast. Perhaps the first quote I would like to highlight is from Praktob. He is the maintainer of SimpleCov, or I don't know, the person who runs the Ruby user group in Berlin. He says that if you want to explain performance to beginners, try to imagine two rabbits trying to get from point A to point B. Yeah, of course, one aspect would be which rabbit arrives faster. But then the other aspect is how many carrots did each of them need to achieve that, right? So it's not just about reaching faster, but how many resources did you actually consume while reaching faster. That's an aspect of performance. Also, when I say the word good or bad performance, that on its own is not an objective measure, right? There is no such thing as this is good, absolutely, no. So I also try to ask people, how would you describe to a beginner a good performance? Here you will find two groups of answers, and actually it's very clear like that there is a division into the industry into looking at this. There is the very academic answer of this. Yeah, being good performant means that you're achieving a specific task faster while consuming less resources. Yeah, that's one way of looking at a good thing, but how do you really measure this? Like, where is the line where you would say this is good and this is bad? The second group of answers, which I like more, is that this lies in your business, this lies in your problem, and it's your users, right? Because maybe one thing that is done here super fast works for your business, so that's enough. You don't need to extra optimize it. If it's already generating the money, that's enough. So yeah, this sentiment, Ruby is slow. Like, it's a sentiment probably you hear so many times, it's so many times on the internet. And while we of course agree, Ruby's computational performance is not its strongest characteristic by design. It was never designed to be a highly computational language. That was not the intention. It was always focusing on the concept of developer happiness. That was from the 1990s until today, that was the whole idea behind Ruby. And languages are tools, right? Languages are, while they have a clear impact on performance, right, because of their own implementations, but using one language does not dictate your performance. By that, I can give an example that there are, I don't remember the gem, I think it was Mongoid. They had a native C extension written in C, but really bad C, that when they rewrote it in Ruby, it became faster, right? So, so it's not just the language that decides fast or slow, also the quality of the code you write impacts that. This talk here from Curtis Rainbolt Green from VCR, he says that he believes that this sentence came from the early Ruby times, when there was a lot of experimentation from people who usually wrote C or wrote Java, right? And they were used to solving a specific problem set that didn't really fit what Ruby was built for. You don't, and I really want you to focus, if you want to come out with this talk from one sentence, is this one. You don't really need microsecond level performance to sell clothes on the internet at a massive profit. And speaking of that, there are a lot of examples of using Ruby in a very performant way. You can go to this webpage on the Ruby documentation. NASA uses Ruby, for God's sake. I mean, yeah. Saying that doesn't mean that I'm now defending Ruby and I'm saying we should stop working on that, right? I'm just saying that let's stop complaining about this and look at what's next. There are already alternative Ruby implementations that shows us that Ruby's performance optimization is possible, right? You have Tropfer Ruby, you have JRuby. We already know that Ruby can be faster. Yeah, Hideous, or Charles Nutters, the leader of JRuby, says, there are edge features in Ruby that definitely makes performance optimization harder, right? So the language inherently has a problem in this. But So everyone here is familiar with Ruby 3.3, the times 3 thing. To explain that, Mats and the core team a few years ago came out with this term to explain this new idea that Ruby 3.0 will be 3 times faster than Ruby 2.0. That was the statement. That was the bold statement that they were always tossing. I asked people about their opinions, and I think at the moment this is the most debatable thing in the Ruby world. Because, yeah, you got the first group which were saying things like, yeah, this goal is very high and hard to achieve. How can we even get to 3 times faster? It's impossible. The funny thing is that there is another big portion of people that says that this bar is so low. I mean, Truffle Ruby is already 12 times faster. I don't get it. Why do you want to get just to 3? My favorite answer is, this metric is so vague. What do you mean Ruby 2.0, 3.0 is faster 3 times than 2.0? Faster doing what? Faster doing this specific benchmark set? Okay, is it faster really in life? So at the beginning, when the term was tossed, there was this idea that there will be 3 times 3, so 9 benchmarks that we will use to measure. For some reason, this idea disappeared, and now we are back to using opt-caret, which doesn't really mimic reality, because with the just-in-time compiler, Ruby 2.6 is faster with opt-caret, but it's slower with Rails, which probably most of us really care about. Yeah, there are steps to go to get to this 3.0 that has been achieved so far. C Ruby 2.6 was shipped, as I mentioned, and as Sotaro previously mentioned, with just-in-time compiler. And while I can give a full talk about what's just-in-time and compiler, we need to know that it doesn't have that impact yet. Just-in-time compiler being in Ruby 2.6 didn't really make Ruby faster, right? Yet. I think the best quote to explain this is from Chris Seaton. Chris Seaton is the developer lead of Truffle Ruby project. He said that he thinks that the optimization efforts has this like ice hockey stick shape, right? You basically need to add a lot of optimization and you just get almost nothing out of them. Ruby in its nature is so dynamic. You have to really go a long way down the stick, doing so much work, and you are really getting nothing out of it. Until this moment that you will get to the Ruby code at deep level, and then you can actually achieve a serious increase in performance. That's why the just-in-time compiler in 2.6 is not useful, but it is a very important step for the 3.0 release. Perhaps the last sentence he said is that you usually get 10% of performance gain from 90% of the work, and then the rest goes the opposite direction. When I asked Chris Seaton what was his main motivation behind working on Truffle Ruby, he said it was performance. So C Ruby's performance was the main reason he did that. Charles Nutters, though, was the opposite. He said that it wasn't performance that made him go to start JRuby. It was more the idea of it was more the idea of, there is a missing slide here, more the idea of being able to work with other JVM languages at the same time. And then when they started doing that, they realized, oh yeah, we can also make it faster, so let's work on that. I think a few other aspects of performance, and I cannot stress this more. Let's try to stop over-engineering when it comes to performance. If it's not important for your business, don't pre-optimize. Ruby Sphere in general has a lot of good tools for profiling and benchmarking. This is something I think Ruby is doing quite well. Not the best, there are other things, but I think it's good enough. What I think we are really lacking is learning resources for real-life cases for performance optimizations. In Pavel's talk, he mentioned rewriting something in Rust because of a performance optimization. I would love to see a full talk about what was the bottleneck, right? Like more analysis of what was the bottleneck, how did you get there, why did Rust solve that, how can we solve that in the Ruby community. I usually see that the performance optimization talks in conferences focus again on a to-do list, and I don't know, doesn't really match our business requirements. One last sentence is that if you maintain some gem, you clearly have an extra burden about performance than application engineers, right? Your gem can be used in many applications, so then you need to pre-optimize a bit, unlike the application engineers people. The second focal point, which I try to focus a lot on, is this Ruby, the language, versus the C implementation, which I think is among the most the hardest concept to grasp as a beginner in the Ruby world. right? What do we mean when we say JRuby or Truffle Ruby? What are these things, right? What people need to understand is that Ruby is a programming language. It is just a specification and characteristics. Ruby is not a program. Ruby is just some characteristics and specifications of syntax and how this syntax behaves. That's it. CRuby, the one that we usually refer to as Ruby, is only one implementation of these specifications. It's the oldest one, it's the more mature one, of course, it's the longest living one, but it's only one, and there are other implementations of this language. Dr. Ivo Anjo, he's one of the Amazon profiler team that is really a big fan of JRuby. And when I asked him about it, he said that this problem is not Ruby specific, right? Because Python also has multiple implementations, for example. What makes it really, really bad in the Ruby sphere is that unlike other languages, JRuby and Truffle Ruby are really good quality implementations of this language. They are not toys, they are not experiments. They are really good quality implementations of this language that in some aspects can even succeed the original implementation, the CRuby. I can also again give a full talk about comparing CRuby with Truffle Ruby, with JRuby. I think there are 1 million resources online, and I don't think this talk is the good platform for it. But let me try to highlight some quotes from people I talked to who used CRuby or JRuby or Truffle Ruby in production. Jacob Matthews, he works at Hotel Tonight, Airbnb. Yeah, Dr. Ivo and Jacob both speak for their own views, not for their employers because of legal stuff. He works at Airbnb, and he said that they use JRuby at Hotel Tonight, and he thinks that JRuby is really unfairly overlooked. It's a brilliant project, but people are not giving it enough attention. Dr. Ivo again said that JRuby developers, when they use it in Amazon, they were really responsive. They fixed every issue they faced super fast. Again, Jacob, and I think I really share this, Truffle Ruby can be the most exciting thing that happened in the Ruby sphere since Rails. Charles Nutters, when I asked him why would I use JRuby, he said, well, think about it. You get to keep Ruby while gaining everything the Java platform has to offer. And you don't really need to run one line of Java. That's it. Chris Seaton says that Truffle Ruby is faster, it runs other languages beside Ruby, and it has much better debugger. As I said, there are plenty of talks from the core teams. Please invest some time and try to watch them. There are downsides, right? Like these things are not perfect as it seems, right? The first downside that I like this quote a lot. We are Rubyists, we are scared of Java. You tell me you will need to configure the JVM, and people are like, no, I don't want to deal with Java. There is the obvious, the most famous problem about JRuby is that its startup time, especially in development environment, is really painful, right? So its runtime is faster, but it takes some time to start everything. So when you are developing, it adds this annoying feeling. And what Charles Nutters said about this is that they have been exploring a lot of JVM features that shows promise. So he promises that this will be fixed. And there is, in general, this whole renewed interest in precompiling Java to native code, which can solve this whole problem anyways. The other problem in JRuby, I think, is that Java, the JVM's garbage collection strategies are amazing. They are so good, but it still consumes a bit more memory than C, right? It's still a bit more hungry. Unfortunately, Truffle Ruby is still early to use in production, right? Because there is compatibility gap between MRI. MRI is the other way to speak about CRuby, right? It's Matt's Ruby implementation or CRuby. So there is a compatibility gap. There are things that are implemented in CRuby but are still not in Truffle Ruby. And CRuby is not done. This is a project that's not finished. It's a project that changes every day. So once you catch them and implement this, they already implemented new stuff. So it's a bit hard to catch up. I think there are a lot of challenges that has been faced by those maintainers. Perhaps the biggest challenge is this CRuby's test suite. So as I said, it started from the beginning that CRuby is going to be Ruby. So they never thought about writing down these specifications outside the C project, right? The specifications of the Ruby language was part of the test suite of CRuby. So in order to test your code, test your Truffle Ruby, you need to run it against the test suite of CRuby, which doesn't really make sense. But luckily, there is a project now called Ruby Unified Specs. It's going for almost a year now, I think, and it's going in that direction of writing one clear unified specifications for the Ruby programming language that all the implementations should run against. Of course, there is the lack of development resources. JRuby, for example, is maintained by 2 people. Yeah, full time, but still 2 people. And then the mother of all problems. I'm sorry, Arafat, I know that you like C extensions, but everyone's familiar with the term native C extensions. Like a quick brief. Like C is a language that was born in the 70s, in the early 70s. That's around 20 years older than Ruby. And unlike Ruby, it is a language that's low level, compiled. It has been meant, it was built for performance, right? And oftentimes in the Ruby sphere, like Arafat explained earlier in the TensorFlow binding, we would like to use C code from our Ruby code, right? So we would write some C extension that would use the C code for performance gains because it's faster. Or because there is some existing C library that we would like to use and we don't want to rewrite it completely from scratch, so we would like to use this interface. Again, I think C extensions is going to be my next talk, so this is a talk I am planning to prepare of its problems, but I love this sentence from Charles Nuttall. He says, in my opinion, C extensions are the largest thing holding Ruby back. Think about it, right? When you have multiple implementations that don't depend on C, like then the compatibility breaks. And there is solutions. There is the FFI, there is the SWIG, but not all the C extensions at the moment are using these foreign language interfaces. So it's obvious that it makes it harder to support these other implementations, but they actually have a negative impact on C Ruby itself. It's not just affecting JRuby or Truffle Ruby. So this blog post is from Tender Love from Aaron Patterson, where he speaks about how his memory optimization efforts are being hustled because of the existence of native C extensions in different Ruby gems. Make sure to go and check it out. The only team that's probably a bit more optimistic about the C extensions is actually the Truffle Ruby team, because they are mostly academics. They work with, their whole idea is being compatible with a lot of other languages. So for them, with enough research, they could get over this problem. On a final note, from Tobias again, he says, his advice to you is before you rush to rewrite performance bottlenecks with Rust or Elixir, just try to switch to JRuby, right? Just try it. It's not going to cost you so much. Just try to change your Ruby version to be JRuby, see how much it works. Maybe it gives you this performance gain that you have this problem with. Maybe not. I think that a lot more talks and real-life use cases should be shared in the Ruby community, right? Like, I hope that from now on, every conference should have stuff speaking about a JRuby project or a Truffle Ruby project or something like that. The third topic is what I like to refer to as multi-core CPU utilization, or what people would refer to as concurrency, parallelism, whatsoever. I would like to give some warning. There are some cliche slides, but I find that without these slides, not everyone can be on board, so you might have seen some of these slides before. Do you know who is that guy? Anyone knows? So this guy's called Gordon Moore. He is one of the founders of Intel, and I don't really care about his work or business. There's just one thing that makes me bring him into this conversation, which is called the Moore's law, or the Moore's observation. Basically, this is a simple law that he said that he realized that in a circuit, the number of transistors will double almost every 2 years. So almost every 2 years, the size of this thing will become half, so we can have more transistors. And if you don't know, a processor is just a bunch of transistors, and the more you have, the more computational performance you will be able to have. So in a nutshell, what he meant is that engineers will be able to double the performance of a processor almost every 2 years. And while this actually worked, I think, from the beginning of the 50s until like 2010, the actual observation didn't stop working, but other things started to make the processor slower. That got us to this aspect that we need to have more than one processor core into devices, right? Almost our phones now have multi-cores. Our computers have multi-cores. Almost every device. There are, I think, washing machines now that have multi-cores for some reason. And that introduces the need for this thing like called concurrency and parallelism, right? Which is like you don't execute one single execution of your code. You need to have multiple of them running concurrently. So the other part that I think is a cliche is that people usually forget is that concurrency and parallelism are not synonyms. Concurrent is the top part. Concurrent is when several tasks are happening at the same times, but not in an overlapping time. Parallel has to be exactly at the same moment of execution, right? So if I am moving my phone from here to there, I put it in the middle, and then I take my headphones, put it also in the middle, and then I take the phone a bit, and then I take my headphones. I am doing those concurrently. But if I take them both at the same time, that's called parallelism. Those are not the same concept. Ruby, in general, is awfully behind in this. And by Ruby here, I'm more focusing on C Ruby, right? On C Ruby in one aspect, and Ruby in general in another aspect. So in Ruby, we don't have parallelism in C Ruby specifically, right? We cannot run two pieces of Ruby code on the same thread. You can, so I know that people will start shouting with using different processes, but you cannot do it with two threads in the same process. Using different processes has a lot of problems because a process consumes much more memory. So when you have multiple processes running at the same time, you have massive memory consumption in some cases, especially that Ruby's implementation, the method Ruby like process.fork, does not utilize the copy and write. So actually every single time you will call a process.fork in Ruby, it will dump the whole memory again. So you're just doubling your memory. If you have a Rails application, it becomes double the application memory. You can end up with zombie process, and trust me, especially if you are not white like me, you don't want to Google how to kill orphan zombies. Something you don't want to ever do. I think there are successful projects that use that approach. I think many of us actually use that approach in their production systems, and Rescue use that approach. A lot of web servers use that approach, but we want to be able to use multi-threading. We want to be able to use those small things that can share the same memory and consume less. And we want them not to be just running concurrently, but to be running in parallel, because it's important to know in Ruby you can run multiple threads concurrently, but not in parallel. I think the problem that stops this is something that people refer to as the global interpreter lock, or the global virtual machine lock. And I try to understand, I try to explain this in a beginner's way. Some person from the interviews who likes to stay anonymous says that, in his opinion, GIL, or the global interpreter look, is something that resembles these traffic lights on a busy crossing, right? You have multiple threads, and you don't want them all to be trying to get to your memory at the same time. So you kind of put off this traffic that they cannot go at the same time. If your threads are cars, you don't want them to basically carelessly drive through. The solution, he continues, is that you have multiple layers, right? You have multiple roads. You don't let them running in the same road, more or less. Charles Nutters believes that the best alternative for the JVL, at least for now, is to simply not use C Ruby. Use JRuby because it does not have a global interpreter lock. Simple. Ruby 3.0, which was mentioned already a lot, promises to remove global interpreter lock, or promises to at least deal with that issue. No clue how yet, but there is a promise. The second aspect, which I think is way more important, is that concurrent programming is really hard. I don't know for you if you are like super smart and you can go and like write concurrent code and parallel programming so easily. I suffer every single time I'm writing something that is gonna leverage multi-threading. Race conditions, I need to go back to my university notes to remember from the beginning, yeah, what was this thing, what was that thing? So I think it's still something hard. And Ruby does not have enough abstractions on this complexity. Ruby gives you terms that are very close to the machine. We need to have this kind of higher level abstractions like many other languages do at the moment. Concurrency abstractions are things that borrow a lot from existing things like distributed system architecture. You can think of the same model and just apply it in the programming language. There is the actor model in Elixir. Probably almost every person I know moved from Ruby to Elixir. Their answer when I asked why was, yeah, they have the actor model. Right? I need something that abstracts this complexity of concurrency and parallelism for me. There is the Go routines in Golang, right? There is a lot of abstractions. And while Ruby 3.0, like I can tell you that Ruby 3.0 in the last 5 years, I watched a lot of talks about Ruby 3.0 where every single talk I hear a different proposal about how the next Ruby 3.0 abstraction will be. We heard about the term guilds, which was changed, then at some point was thrown out, then at some point we're back. I am not exactly sure what will be in Ruby 3.0. I wish I know. No one is actually exactly sure. So yeah, let's see. The next focal point is what I call syntactical innovation. I think that Ruby syntax is among the least debated aspects of Ruby. People usually like Ruby syntax. Not many people complain about Ruby syntax, maybe JavaScript people, but the rest usually like Ruby syntax. But I would say that a lot of people are complaining about the lack of syntactical innovation since Ruby 1.9. So since Ruby 1.9, we don't see much new stuff coming into Ruby or much new stuff being removed. Perhaps the reason that always comes up when Mats is asked or the core team is asked is something like, yeah, we want to always take care of backward compatibility. We do not want to repeat the Python 3 example, right? When Python 3 came out, but no one migrated to it because it was so different from Python 2. But we also do not want to repeat the Perl 6 example, where Perl 6 took so long to come out that when it came out, no one was doing Perl anymore. I have some special mentions about that is the keywords arguments. I think that was like an amazing addition to Ruby in 2.3, I think, maybe. Safe Navigator, the worst thing that ever came to Ruby that also can be a talk. I don't know why was that added. I think it made our Ruby code much worse in the last few years. If you are using it, try to not use it. Pattern matching is going to come in Ruby 2.7. I haven't spent so much time, but I'm quite excited about Ruby 2.7 because I think it's the first version in a while that started to have these new experimental features. So pattern matching is coming in Ruby 2.7. Who knows about the pipe operator scandal? Yeah, so yeah, there was a new operator that was borrowed from functional programming languages. It was finally, by the way, revoked yesterday. So Ruby 2.7 will not have the weird pipe operator. Thanks God. Short syntax of block arguments. The one that is when you say like array.each and then you don't pass the name of the argument and then you use @1. That's merged in Ruby 2.7 at the moment. Yes, and there was another plan to change it to be it, but then we have the problem that it intersects with RSpec, for example. I don't know how many people use RSpec, so try to imagine a Ruby release breaking RSpec completely. Community contribution has to come into this part. I think that is for me the biggest problem of Ruby. The foundation of open source software is about enabling people to engage in discussions. We have to have a way to speak, right? We have to be able to drive these big projects together to a direction, I wouldn't say that we all agree on, but at least a direction that we all feel comfortable with. I don't know what's happening. In reality, this is not always perfect, right? In reality, what happens is that there is knowledge silos, there are people taking the decisions for everyone. And I think that Ruby can still improve a lot on that. I think that the core team and the people who are more involved into committing to C Ruby needs to invest more time, more talks, and more resources on helping people how to contribute. Ruby is a 26, 27 years old project, code base written in C. Not all of us are good with C, not all of us are familiar with language implementation, not all of us are familiar with so many things. Try to involve people, try to simplify the system itself to people. How can you contribute? I know at least 3 people that tried to solve the Ruby fork copy on write issue, and they just couldn't, and they were never offered help. I think that initiatives like contribution mentorship should be considered. There should be a way that when someone wants to contribute to Ruby, they get a mentor from the core team. Even if that slows down the core team, I think it's more valuable for the Ruby community that more people are involved in contribution than actually releasing things faster. Community members also carry a big part of this. It's not, your contribution is not just about writing code, right? You should try to find an adequate way that fits your skills to contribute. At the end, you all need to think about this. Ruby is a programming project, exactly like the code you work on at work, right? It's a project that will have mistakes, strategical mistakes, and it's a project that you can at some point take part of. It's nothing like super scary. It's just a software that's written. Some honorable mentions in that aspect. This year, we finally had C Ruby moving to Git. And I don't know for you, but in the past, C Ruby wasn't in Git, it was in SVN. And I don't know how big is that impact for you, but because for me it was. Like, finally I can just go to GitHub and check the source code and take part in that conversation, right? Charles Nutters specifically, he says, like Charles Nutters is in a lot of conferences, and he says that his main reason is to try to involve more people. That's why he travels around. He loves, of course, to meet Rubyists, and he wants to invite them to help and use JRuby. Next point is coupling with Rails. I don't know if you go to the Ruby documentation, Ruby is a general purpose programming language. It's not a web programming language. You can use Ruby for other things. And if you can use it only for web, I swear there are other web frameworks than Rails. Rails is not the only Ruby framework, I swear. Try them out. Some of them are amazing. Some of them are way better than Rails. Just try out. I think the best explanation of this problem is this quiz here. There was this quiz which was called Ruby or Rails. This is a quiz of 10 questions that shows you random methods, either from active support or from Ruby, and asks you, do you think this is a Ruby method or a Rails method? And from what I heard, Matt scored 8 out of 10. Some other small points is the Ruby standard library has a lot of outdated things, a lot of things that needs to be refurbished. Metaprogramming is a good thing, but not always a good thing. So try to, like, I think we had this big hype in the Ruby community maybe 10 years ago when Rails came out, or it's 15 years ago now, when Rails came out, that people started to be, metaprogramming is the thing for everything, and that makes people coming out from Ruby like really struggling. Metaprogramming is not easy to understand as you think. So finally, I really would like to finish this, I know that I complained a lot, by saying that Ruby is awesome. And more important than Ruby being awesome, I think Rubyists are awesome. I have been to so many conferences, and I still can relate to Rubyists much more than many other languages. And this project was my way, my selection of how can I probably effectively contribute to this language that I spend so much time with. Maybe I wouldn't be the best if I just go and try to tackle a C problem. Maybe that's the way, like I have bigger network, maybe that's my efficient way to do that. Try to think, what is yours? Another thing is that this presentation is not the project, right? This presentation is just one form of sharing like small highlights and small quotes. Like the project is much bigger, and in the future there will be like focuses on just one specific thing, digging deeper into that. Finally, if you like this project, I would like to ask you, first of all, spread the word, right? Like if you meet people, tell them that there is this thing going on. Contact me to sit for interview. I don't care, you're a beginner, you're a mid-year, you're a senior, I don't care who you are. Please try to reach out and say, I would like to sit and say my opinion. Recommend someone. You have some colleagues that you know that their opinions are valuable. Recommend them to come and talk to me. Finally, as I said, for the last 3 months, I have a lot of issues, and I realized I really need volunteers to help on this. It's a lot of work. I have to honestly say, when I started, I didn't think it would be that much work, but it's actually a lot of work. So if you have some time in your hand and you don't want to waste it in something else, just call me and let's, work together. And that's it. Thank you.
Any questions? Okay. Here's the first one.
Oh, thank you, first of all, for this talk. It's really, I think, covers maybe all issues and problems that exist in the ecosystem. I really made a lot of notes in my phone, but the issue is that each new topic actually covered my note.
Nice, thank you.
So maybe it would be not just equation, but also like participating in this discussion, and maybe a little bit of my experience and understanding what is the problem. Speaking about JRuby, I really also think that it's not really good that this project is not viral yet. But the problem is that only recently, maybe this year, they implemented compatibility to Ruby 2.5, I think, and it's really the major why it was holding down so much. And not working C extensions is also a huge problem. So we really use JRuby on our current production project, and we experience all this shit that is happening. We really need to carefully pick those gems that do not use the extensions. We need to avoid some glitches, like not working mixins or something. But that's okay. I really wanted also to emphasize about Elixir and Actor models that was t- spoken by you, but it's not only about Actor models, I think, but when we are talking about concurrency, it's about the whole OTP framework that exists in the Erlang. And when you think about, at this time was thinking about how much effort is needed to create at least something, at least close to the whole OTP ecosystem, it really, I would better use Elixir and forget about everything than just try to bring it to the Ruby. And why actually? Because it covers another problem. So there is problems that you mentioned about sticking to Rails. I would say like Ruby is a mono ecosystem. It's really dictated by Rails. And the problems that you said, okay, we are afraid to introduce new method because it would break our spec. There is two issues. One is why the hell you are, why one project dictates to the whole ecosystem, and the second, why this language allows for this really at least to happen. So all this metaprogramming and all this flexibility really put Ruby to the dead end. So now you are really, it's like a deadlock. You cannot move because you.
It's a chicken egg problem, right? It's this like what happens of those first, basically.
Yeah, and maybe from my point of view, one of the biggest issues in Ruby and C-Ruby is that it's not really transparent. And what is Mats is doing and what is his team is doing. And as you also mentioned, this pipe operator, it was like a blast on the Twitter. Wow, pipe operator, what the hell? And then a couple of months as we were, I don't know, spent, and we are reverting it because nobody actually asked anything. And for example, I can say about PHP ecosystems, they really have a council for about like tens of people from the majority of the frameworks, and this council really make votes for proposals for changes to the language. I do not see anything even closer to this in Ruby community, unfortunately, and it also says that it could be a dead end for the language. I really like your intentions, but I wouldn't be such positive.
I would like to ask you to sit for an interview. I think that's
maybe. Yeah, and also I know that Pavel also Zvetkovsky has written a blog post, as I remember, about the future of the Ruby. He's also very concerned about the future, so he should be in the interview also. So thank you.
Please.
Hey, thanks a lot for your talk, Amr. It's super. I love seeing this pushback against hype, and how, I think we can all talk about that. No, my question is out of curiosity. You said that this isn't the only form that the project has taken. I'm curious. Is there any kind of write-up of your research so far, any of the interviews, or do you need help with that?
Yes. So my original plan was I wrote a lot of markdowns, right, scattered on my gist and on Twitter and stuff. The part I need help in is in a lot of documentation, in a lot of like writing blog posts, like for example, taking C extensions, focusing on that topic, speaking a lot on that, right? But it really takes a lot of time because there is also the time of organizing, organizing the interview time. Sometimes it's voice, sometimes it's written, and then sometimes you need to transcribe, and it's really a lot of hassle. But yeah, like the idea I have in mind would be to have something like this. I just don't have resources, like time resources to do that. If you would help, I would really appreciate it. Yeah.
I want to, yes.
Cool.
Thank you.